At first, it seemed like just another day on a Texas ranch. But one strike of a shovel changed everything. What the rancher found underground would start a story the whole country would talk about. Watch until the end. You won't believe how it ends. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun rose slowly over the Texas plains, painting the fields in shades of gold and rust. Tom Richardson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he leaned against the old fence post. His work gloves were covered in dust. The morning was quiet except for the distant hum of insects and the creak of dry wood in the wind. This land had belonged to his family for nearly 100 years. It was passed down from his grandfather, who built the ranch out of the wild prairie. Every inch of it carried memories. Storms survived, cattle moved, fences built and rebuilt. For Tom, it was more than land. It was a living piece of his history. But lately, it had become a heavy weight. The past few years had been hard. The drought had turned the grass into cracked earth, and his small herd of cows was getting smaller. Bills piled up faster than he could pay them. Sometimes, as he looked out across the empty fields, he wondered how long he could keep it all going. Still, he kept working, fixing fences, mending roofs, taking care of the few cows that were left. He told himself that as long as he could lift a hammer, the ranch would stand. That morning, he loaded the bed of his old pickup truck with tools, new fence posts, and a bottle of coffee. The eastern fence line had needed repair for months, and he was finally ready to get it done. As he drove through the property, the truck rattled over dry ruts and rocks. The land stretched endlessly on both sides, dotted with mesquite trees and the faint glimmer of a creek bed that hadn't seen water in a long time. When he reached the fence, he parked, stepped out, and breathed in deeply. The smell of sun-baked soil and faint traces of grass filled the air. He took a moment to feel grateful. No matter how tough things got, this was still home. He started his work in a steady rhythm, pulling up old posts and digging fresh holes. The pattern of it was almost calming. Dig, lift, plant, hammer. The sound of metal striking wood echoed through the still air. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the shade grew thin. When he reached the northern corner of the property, he noticed one of the posts had rotted nearly to the bottom. He drove the shovel into the hard-packed ground, prying it loose. On the third swing, the shovel stopped short with a dull clang. Tom frowned and tried again. The metal blade hit something solid beneath the dirt. Not rock, not roots. It sounded hollow. He knelt and brushed away the soil with his hands. The earth was dry and crumbly, and soon he could see the faint curve of something metal beneath. His curiosity grew. Maybe it was a piece of old farm equipment left by his grandfather years ago. The ranch was full of buried old things, rusted tools, broken wagon parts, even an old horseshoe once found by his father near the barn. But this felt different. He dug deeper, widening the hole. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the object was large and round. After several minutes, the edge of a blue surface appeared under the dirt, streaked with rust. It was an old barrel. Tom sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The barrel was standing upright in the ground, as if someone had buried it on purpose. It was strange. He checked for markings, but the paint had long since worn away. A faint, oily smell lingered, and the sides were cool to the touch. He thought about leaving it. Whatever was inside had been there for many years. But curiosity pulled at him stronger now. What if it was some kind of dangerous waste? Or worse, a grave? The thought sent a chill through him, though the midday heat pressed heavy on his skin. He stood and glanced around the open field. No one for miles. The only sound was the soft buzz of insects and the wind scraping across the dry grass. He went back to the truck, grabbed his gloves, and returned to dig around the barrel. With every scoop of dirt, the shape grew clearer. The top edge came into view, a sealed lid, the kind used to keep contents airtight. It looked like it had been buried on purpose, not accidentally lost or left behind. That thought made him uneasy. He paused, leaning on the shovel, thinking. Maybe it was an old oil drum from a previous owner, or something dumped illegally back in the 1970s when no one asked questions. Still, something about the way it sat in the ground, perfectly upright, perfectly sealed, felt planned. After nearly an hour of digging, Tom had cleared enough dirt to reveal the full top of the barrel. He wiped his forehead again and crouched to look at the lid. It was sealed with a heavy steel band and a padlock, rusted, but still holding strong. He tapped the side. It was thick, unmoving, and heavier than he expected. When he tried to tilt it, it barely budged. Whatever was inside wasn't liquid. It was solid and heavy. He stood up straight and looked toward his truck. He had chains in the back he could use to pull it out. As he worked to attach the chains around the barrel's middle, the tension in his chest grew. There was something unsettling about disturbing something that had been buried so long. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was probably nothing, scrap metal, old farm supplies, or maybe some forgotten stash of fuel. But as he tightened the chains and started the truck, a flicker of doubt nagged at the back of his mind. The tires spun in the dirt. The chain went tight, and with a loud pop of breaking soil, the barrel came free. It rolled slightly, caked in mud, dented from the pull, but still sealed tight. Tom shut off the engine and walked over, the sound of his boots crunching against the dry ground. He stared at it for a long time. The barrel stood there, silent and stubborn, like a secret pulled from the earth. He crouched and knocked on the lid again. Hollow. He tilted his head, listening. Nothing. No slosh, no rattle. Just silence. He felt the faintest rush of excitement. Maybe it was something valuable. Old coins, equipment. Who knew? He laughed quietly at the thought. Yeah, right, he muttered. My luck, it's just trash. Still, his curiosity wouldn't let him stop now. He fetched the bolt cutters from his toolbox and returned to the barrel. The padlock was orange with rust, and it snapped easily under pressure. The steel band creaked as he loosened it. A faint metallic groan came from the lid as he pried it up an inch. The air that escaped was stale, heavy with the scent of time and earth. He lifted a little higher and froze. Beneath the lid, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic and cloth, were small rectangular bundles neatly stacked to the top. His heart began to pound. He reached out, hesitated, and then pulled one bundle closer to the light. The corner tore slightly, revealing the edge of green paper. He blinked. It couldn't be. He peeled it back further and saw the face of Benjamin Franklin staring back at him. Tom dropped the package and staggered backward, his breath quickening. The pit of his stomach turned cold. He looked around the empty field again, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The barrel wasn't just old. It was a time capsule of something dangerous. Money. A lot of it. Far too much for any ordinary man to bury. He took a deep breath, closed the lid carefully, and reached for his phone. With shaking fingers, he dialed 911. As the operator answered, his voice was barely steady. "This is Tom Richardson," he said. "I think I found something buried on my property. You'd better send someone out here." The wind blew softly through the dry grass as he waited, staring at the ground where the barrel had rested for many years. The land that had once given his family everything had just brought up a secret of its own, and Tom had no idea how much his life was about to change. Tom stood in the silence of the field, the weight of what he had uncovered pressing down harder than the Texas sun. The phone call to 911 still echoed in his mind. The operator had told him to stay put, that officers would be on their way. Now, waiting felt unbearable. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the barrel. Its once blue surface was streaked with mud and time, the rusted lid barely holding together. Something about it felt almost alive now, as if the land itself had tried to keep its secret buried. He took a few steps back, the unease crawling higher in his chest. A man could live his whole life thinking he knew his land, and still the earth could surprise him. The hours dragged on. Then, the faint dust cloud of approaching vehicles appeared on the horizon. Tom exhaled with relief. 2 sheriff's cars and a black SUV rolled up, the engines cutting through the quiet air. Men in uniform stepped out first, followed by 2 plain-clothed officers who carried themselves with the calm control of people used to walking into mysteries. One of them, a tall man with a trimmed beard and sharp eyes, approached Tom and introduced himself as Agent Carter with the FBI. Tom shook his hand, still feeling the grime of the morning's work on his skin. He tried to speak, to explain everything exactly as it happened, but his voice faltered. Carter raised a hand, telling him to take it slow. They moved toward the barrel together, the other officers forming a small circle. Carter knelt beside it, looking at the surface, then motioned for a forensics team to move in. They began taking photographs, collecting soil samples, and marking the scene as if it were a crime still happening. Tom stood a few yards away, watching. It felt unreal. He'd spent his whole life fixing fences and tending cattle. Now his ranch looked like something out of a news broadcast. The officers pried open the lid again, and this time they didn't flinch. Inside were the same carefully wrapped packages he had seen, rows of them, each one identical in size and tightly sealed in plastic. One of the technicians sliced open a corner, revealing stacks of $100 bills, so old they had yellowed slightly around the edges. The sight of that much money made Tom's stomach twist. He knew immediately this wasn't lost savings or some forgotten stash. This was something else entirely. Agent Carter straightened up and looked at Tom. "You did the right thing calling us," he said quietly. "This looks like it's been here a long time." He asked Tom to recount the details again. When he found it, how deep it was buried, whether anyone else knew about the discovery. Tom told him everything, word for word. The agent listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. There was no blame in his tone, only the steady curiosity of a man fitting together pieces of a very old puzzle. By late afternoon, they had removed the rest of the barrel's contents. Each bundle was listed, weighed, and photographed. The bills, though aged, were real. Carter turned to one of his team members, who murmured something under his breath that Tom didn't catch. Then Carter said aloud, "Get the serial numbers checked immediately." The phrase sent a ripple of unease through Tom. Serial numbers meant history, records, evidence, connection. He began to understand that whatever this was, it went far beyond his property. When the work paused, Carter approached him again. "Mr. Richardson," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "We think this money may be connected to some old cartel activity. The way it's packed, the way it's buried, it fits a pattern we've seen before." Tom blinked in disbelief. "Cartel? You mean drugs?" Carter nodded. "Most likely from the 1980s, back when the border was chaos. They moved cash, drugs, and weapons through routes that ran right through Texas. Sometimes they buried the money to hide it during transport. Not all of it was ever found." Tom stared out at the open field. He remembered stories his father used to tell about those days. Rumors of planes landing in remote fields, trucks disappearing into the desert, people who asked too few questions. He had never imagined that his quiet land, the one his family had worked for generations, might have been part of that dark map. "How long do you think it's been here?" he asked quietly. Carter shrugged. "Judging by the rust, probably 30, maybe 40 years. Whoever buried it never came back." The thought sent a chill down Tom's spine. The idea of someone standing in that same spot many years ago, shoveling dirt over a barrel filled with drug money, was almost too strange to grasp. He imagined them working under cover of night, rushing, afraid, certain that no one would ever find it. And for almost half a century, they were right. As dusk settled, the field turned amber, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass. The officers finished loading the barrel into their vehicle. One of them handed Tom a form to sign, stating that federal property had been recovered from his land. He signed without hesitation. He didn't want the money. He didn't even want to think about it anymore. All he wanted was to go back to the simple work he knew: fixing fences, tending to his herd, keeping his life quiet and steady. But something deep inside told him that the quiet would not return so easily. Before they left, Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep you updated," he said. "You may need to come in for some questions later, but from what we see, you did everything right. You called it in. That matters." Tom nodded, grateful but drained. As the vehicles pulled away, the lights from their cars shrinking into the dark horizon, he stood alone again in the fading light. The ground where the barrel had been was scarred, an open wound in the earth. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. The images replayed over and over. The blue barrel, the stacks of money, the sound of the padlock snapping. He sat by the window, staring out at the outline of his land under the moonlight. For the first time in his life, the ranch didn't feel familiar. It felt foreign, heavy with secrets that had been buried long before he was born. He thought of his grandfather, of all the hands that had worked this soil, and wondered if they had ever known what lay beneath it. The land had kept its secret for many years, waiting for someone to uncover it. Now that he had, it felt like a burden more than a discovery. By morning, word had already spread. The sheriff called to warn him that reporters might show up. But Tom didn't care about cameras or questions. He only cared about what the land meant now. He drove out to the field again, parked by the broken fence, and stood in silence. The wind rustled through the grass like whispers from another time. He crouched down, ran his hand through the soil, and whispered to no one in particular, "What else are you hiding out here?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He filled the hole himself that day, packing the dirt down until the ground was level again. It felt wrong to leave it open, like a wound exposed. As he worked, the sound of his shovel striking the earth echoed across the field, steady and rhythmic. Each strike felt like a small act of taking back what had always been his. By the time he was done, the sun was setting again. The sky was streaked with orange and violet. He leaned on his shovel, breathing hard, and looked out over the land that had given him everything and now taken something invisible in return. What he didn't yet know was that this discovery, buried so deep in the Texas soil, was not just a relic of someone else's crime. It was the beginning of a story that would pull him into the past, into lives long gone, and eventually lead him back to something he had forgotten how to find, a sense of purpose. The next few days unfolded like a blur of headlights, paperwork, and questions. Tom Richardson found himself sitting in a small interview room at the county sheriff's office, hands clasped on the table as the FBI ran through every detail for the third time. They asked him about his property, about the day of the discovery, about whether anyone had been near that section of land in the past few months. He answered each question as best he could, his voice steady but tired. He had nothing to hide. He was just a man fixing a fence. Agent Carter, calm and careful as always, took notes and nodded thoughtfully. When the questioning ended, Carter leaned back and told him what they had confirmed. The money was real. Nearly $8 million in total, each bill still crisp under its layers of plastic. The serial numbers matched batches taken in major drug raids from the late 1980s. It was cartel money, no doubt about it, most likely linked to Pablo Escobar's operations. The Texas border, Carter explained, had once been filled with hidden routes and underground exchanges. The barrel on Tom's land had likely been part of a smuggling operation that was never finished. Hearing it out loud sent a strange shiver through Tom. It was one thing to suspect, another to know. Escobar's name belonged to history books and TV shows, not to the dusty fields of his family ranch. Yet here he was, connected to it by chance and dirt. Carter assured him he was not under suspicion. They had already checked his background, his finances, his family history. He was clear. Still, the relief didn't come as easily as he thought it would. The weight of what he'd uncovered clung to him like the dust on his boots. When he left the office, the reporters were waiting outside. Cameras flashed. Voices called his name, asking how it felt to find millions in the ground. He muttered something about just doing the right thing and pushed his way through the crowd. The attention made his skin crawl. He hadn't done anything brave. Not really. He had just called the police. But in a world where people sometimes made the wrong choice, that seemed to count for something. Back home, the ranch looked the same but felt different. The field where the barrel had been buried was quiet again, though he couldn't look at it without imagining the blue drum sitting under the earth for 40 long years. He avoided that side of the property for a while, focusing instead on his cattle and repairs. But the calls kept coming. Journalists wanted interviews. Magazines wanted his story. Even a few strangers offered to buy the land, promising him more than it was worth. Tom turned them all down. Money, he thought, had caused enough trouble already. The only call he answered regularly was from Agent Carter, who kept him updated as the investigation unfolded. Weeks later, Carter called with news. "Tom," he said, "you might want to sit down for this." They had traced the cash back to a network of hiding spots used by smugglers in the late 1980s. The discovery on Tom's ranch had helped the FBI connect several missing links between unsolved cases in Texas and New Mexico. In one of those cases, 2 federal agents had vanished during a raid on a cartel convoy near the Rio Grande. Documents found during the renewed investigation suggested that part of the lost money had been buried as evidence, meant to be picked up later by someone who never made it back. Tom listened in silence, the weight of it settling in. What had begun as a broken fence post had somehow reopened old wounds that had haunted families for many years. "You helped more people than you realize," Carter said before hanging up. Those words stayed with him. The media storm eventually quieted, replaced by a slower trickle of curiosity. Neighbors stopped by to shake his hand, some out of real respect, others just wanting to see the spot where millions had slept beneath the dirt. A few even joked that he should start digging all over the ranch, just in case there were more. Tom smiled politely, But inside he felt something more serious. The discovery had given him a strange sense of perspective. For years, he'd worried about losing the ranch, about debts and dry seasons. Now he saw how fragile everything truly was. The people who buried that money had probably thought they were securing their future, too. Instead, they'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but rust and rot. Time had swallowed their plans whole. As autumn crept in, Tom began to feel restless. Nights were quieter, but his mind wasn't. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn and walk out to the fence line, the place where the story began. He'd stand there in the half-light, watching the mist roll over the grass, and think about the generations before him who had worked this same soil. They had left behind sweat and sacrifice, not secrets. He wanted to honor that again. The land didn't know him wealth. It just asked for care. Slowly, he returned to his routine. He fixed the last of the broken posts, tended the fences that had been forgotten during all the chaos, and planted wildflowers along the road that cut through his property. Small acts of repair. Small steps toward peace. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Carter stopped by the ranch. He wasn't in a suit this time, just jeans and a worn jacket. They sat on the porch, two men bound by a strange twist of fate. Carter told him the case was officially closed. The money had been claimed as evidence and used for research and law enforcement funding. "I know you didn't get a dime of it," Carter said, "but I thought you should know. You helped close a chapter of history." Tom nodded, staring out over the fields. "I guess that's something," he said quietly. Carter smiled. "It's more than something. Most people wouldn't have made that call." After the agent left, Tom stayed outside, listening to the crickets and the soft rustle of the wind. The stars came out one by one, familiar and steady. He thought about the strange journey the land had taken him on, from despair to discovery, from fear to clarity. He realized he had found something after all. Not money, not fame, but a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. The barrel had been a buried secret from another lifetime, and by uncovering it, he had somehow uncovered a part of himself, too. The part that still believed in doing what was right, even when no one was watching. A week later, a letter arrived from Washington. Inside was a simple note of thanks and a small framed certificate recognizing his cooperation and honesty in helping a federal investigation. It wasn't much, but Tom hung it in the living room above the fireplace where his father's old rifle used to rest. It wasn't the kind of reward people dreamed of, but it was enough. When he looked at it, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: pride without regret. By winter, the ranch was quieter than ever. The grass turned brittle, the mornings colder, but the land felt alive again. Sometimes, when the wind blew across the plains, Tom thought he could almost hear it whispering, as if the earth itself was grateful to have its burden lifted. And when he stood by that old fence line, watching the sky fade from blue to dusk, he knew the past had finally settled back into the soil, leaving him free to start anew. Months passed, and the chaos that had once surrounded Tom's discovery slowly faded into memory. The FBI case was closed. The news stories stopped airing, and the people who once crowded his property for interviews had moved on to new headlines. The ranch returned to its usual rhythm: the quiet hum of wind through the fields, the sound of boots on gravel, the low call of cattle at dusk. Yet something within Tom had changed forever. He carried himself with a steadiness that hadn't been there before, as if the storm had stripped away everything unimportant and left behind only truth. The land no longer felt haunted. It felt whole again. And in that stillness, Tom began to rebuild, not just the fences and the barns, but his sense of peace. In the early days after the investigation, the attention had been uncomfortable. Strangers sent letters and donations. People from across the country thanked him for his honesty. Some sent small sums of money. Others offered tools, supplies, even livestock. At first, Tom refused them all, but one letter stopped him. It came from the daughter of one of the agents who had gone missing during the cartel raids many years ago. She wrote that the discovery on his land had helped her family finally understand what had happened. Her words were simple: "You gave us closure we never thought we'd have." Tom sat on his porch that evening, the letter trembling in his hands, and for the first time since finding the barrel, he cried. The money he had uncovered didn't belong to him, but the peace it brought others felt like the greatest reward he could have asked for. As the months turned to seasons, the land began to heal, too. Tom used some of the donations to mend what years of neglect and drought had worn down. He rebuilt the western fence line, repaired the old barn roof, and cleared the dry creek bed that had been choked with brush for years. With help from a few neighboring ranchers, he even started a small cattle rescue. Stray and abandoned livestock from nearby counties found their way to his property, and Tom took them in without question. It wasn't a business. It was something better. It gave him a reason to get up before sunrise again, a rhythm to his days that felt honest and good. The animals seemed to sense his gentleness. They followed him around the pasture like loyal shadows. The ranch that had once been burdened by secrets was now a safe place. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, Tom drove out to the northern field, the same stretch of land where it had all begun. The grass had grown back, thick and golden, hiding any trace of where the barrel had been. He stepped out of the truck and stood in the fading light, the wind brushing against his shirt, carrying the scent of mesquite and soil. For a long time, he just stood there, listening to the land breathe. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comforting, familiar, like a friend who had finally forgiven him for disturbing its rest. He thought about how strange it was that something buried so long ago could change so many lives, including his own. He had dug into the ground expecting to find rot and ruin. But instead, he had uncovered something that reminded him of what truly mattered: honor, honesty, and faith in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Night crept in slowly, painting the horizon in deep violet and orange. Tom sat on the edge of his truck bed, looking up at the stars. They were as bright as they had been when he was a boy, lying on the same land with his father, dreaming of what life might bring. Back then, he'd thought wealth meant freedom. Now he understood it differently. True wealth wasn't found in what you could dig up. It was found in what you could live with and the kind of man you chose to be when tested. The discovery had been a crossroads, and without realizing it, he had chosen the path that led back to peace. It was a quiet kind of happiness, one that asked for nothing more than a clear sky and an honest day's work. As winter settled over Texas, the air grew colder, and mornings brought frost to the grass. Tom didn't mind. He'd rise before dawn, feed the rescued cattle, and walk the fence line with a bottle of coffee in hand. Sometimes he'd pause near the spot where the barrel once rested, not out of fear or curiosity, but out of gratitude. The land no longer held secrets. It held lessons. Life, he had learned, had a way of burying both its treasures and its troubles. It was up to each person to decide which ones to dig up and which ones to let rest. One night near Christmas, a neighbor stopped by to bring him a pie and a small wooden sign she'd carved herself. On it were 3 simple words: "You found peace." Tom smiled as he hung it by the gate the next morning. The words fit better than anything else ever could. They were not about the money, the fame, or even the mystery. It was about the quiet healing that comes when a man faces the unknown and chooses to do what's right. As he looked across the land, the sun rising warm and new, Tom knew that every struggle, every hard year, every lonely morning had led him here, to this moment of stillness, of gratitude, of grace. When he turned to walk back toward the house, his boots pressed softly into the earth, leaving tracks that would fade with the wind. Behind him, the field shimmered with light, endless and alive. He hadn't found treasure. He had found something better. He had found peace. That was the story, an accidental discovery that changed everything. Anyone in his place would have faced the same choice. What would you have done? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss more incredible true stories coming soon.